Welcome back. In this section, we're going to start talking about some of the services that are available as part of the Operations Management Suite that can be provided to you in both Azure cloud-based as well as can support your hybrid implementations or your on-prem implementations. And specifically, we're going to focus on the recovery services. And within recovery services, we're going to talk about data protection of your Azure VMs using the Azure Backup Service. We'll talk about what types of backup are available, specifically the VM snapshot versus the file and folder backups. We'll talk about the backup and recovery policies that you can define and then apply those different policies to different sets of VMs depending upon your specific requirements. And then lastly, we'll talk about Azure Site Recovery, which is a disaster recovery as a service solution where you can actually replicate entire architectures and have them available to spin up should any major failover occur. And that can be done Azure on-prem, and it can support other virtualization engines as well. But within this particular video, we're going to start with the Azure Backup Service and talk about how to protect your Azure VMs and specifically the data within them. And by doing so, we'll walk into the portal. We'll look at what the Azure Backup Service is, how it's actually put together, what makes it hybrid capable. We'll talk about where the actual data gets stored, and that specifically is what's called a vault. And then we'll talk about how to actually assign VMs to your Azure Backup Vault creation. So let's head on over into the portal and we'll get started. Okay, we're back in the portal. And the Azure Backup actually falls under storage. And that's because the primary resource that you're creating is what's called a recovery service vault. And this recovery service vault is used for both the Azure Backup Service as well as the Azure Site Recovery Service, which we'll talk about later on in the section. You also see that there's a couple of classic vaults that were created. They were actually created separately for each individual service. Those are not recommended for use anymore, but they're around for customers who are, in fact, using them from back when those were required. So we'll be focusing, though, on the Recovery Services vaults. As you can see, I've got this starred, so it shows up in my navigation. We can go ahead on in here and click Add. And this is actually fairly straightforward. All we're going to do is give it a name. And I'm going to specify the location of where it's going to be. I'm going to, of course, use one of my existing resource groups and specify that it go into South Central. Once I've done that, I'm going to go behind the scenes. It's going to create a storage vault that can be leveraged for backups as well as for Azure Site Recovery replicas. Unlike a storage account, which customers prior to Azure Backup had to use to be able to perform backups, there isn't really any storage limits, or you don't need to worry about performance limits or anything like that because it is going to be used for such an innocuous service. So you'll notice I got my notification that the vault has been created. So I'm going to go ahead and go to that vault. Let me clear out my navigations here, my notifications. And then you'll see that I've got a number of different items here. The first thing is that I've got two buttons up at the top, one for backup, one for replicate. The replicate obviously is for Azure Site Recovery. Backup is for Azure Backup. You'll see that I've also got a number of different monitoring blades that are available to me out of the box, letting me know about any critical or warnings that might occur within either of these particular services, as well as how much storage, the number of jobs that are currently processing, how many items are replicated for site recovery, and of course all of these can be added and pinned to my dashboard for view every time I open up the portal. And these become very, very important, especially as you add more and more VMs to actually be protected. One other thing I want to point out here in the main overview blade is you'll see an item here called Backup Management Servers. And this is for primarily on-prem VMs. So yes, you can absolutely use Azure Backup with your on-prem VMs, and that's because everything is managed through an agent. However, maybe you don't want to allow all of your VMs to be allowed out through the firewall to connect to this vault to place the necessary backups. And that's where a backup management server can be deployed. You can actually download the backup management server executable, install it on one of your VMs inside of your data center, and then have your VMs talk to it, and then it be the central point of connectivity through your firewalls back into the Azure backup service. Let's now go through what we've got here. So under settings, standard items, properties, locks, automation script, same items that we see all the time, same thing as well as what's in the overview section. Now under getting started, I'm just going to focus on backup. We'll talk about site recovery, as I said, in a future video. Within Azure Backup, you can specify where your backup is going to actually be processing from. Where does the VM exist? In this particular case, I'm going to say Azure. And then what do you want to back up? It's going to be a virtual machine, and that's because that's all that I have. However, if I had virtual machine scale sets available to me, had I left them up from the previous series of videos, then I would be able to do that as well. But I'm going to click backup here, and then what it's going to do is it's going to ask me to choose a backup policy. Now, every time you create a new backup vault, a default policy is made for you. And this backup policy specifies that a backup will occur every day at 7 a.m. And then the retention range of the daily backup point will be retained every day for 30 days. Now, obviously, that is not going to be sufficient for a lot of you or for a lot of enterprise class customers, certainly. So that's where you're going to want to create some custom policies. And we're going to go into those in more detail in the next video. But once I click OK, I then have the ability to add a VM. Now, I only have one VM in my subscription at the moment, and of course, that's in order to keep my costs down. But this would show you every single VM that's available to you in your subscription, and you would be able to add all of them automatically to the vault. Now, this is not the only way that you can actually specify that a VM be set for backup. This is probably one of the easiest ways. But what we can also do is go back into our resource group, find the VM specifically, and I believe I showed you this when we went through the VMs in the previous series of videos, but there's actually a backup navigation item right here under operations. And this then allows me to enable backup specifically for this VM by saying which vault do I want to choose and which backup policy do I want to choose. This therefore allows you to go in and set backups for new VMs after you've created them. Now, this isn't necessarily what every customer wants to do, but certainly in dev and test environments, this makes a lot of sense. Now, let's go back over to the Recovery Service Vault. Site recovery is where you're going to actually prepare and set up for your replication of your architecture. Under monitoring and reports, I can look up at all of the backup jobs that are currently in process. I can also export this information. I can choose specific columns. And all it's really saying is what workload is running, where is the operation, what's the status, what type of backup. In other words, is it a VM snapshot or file and folder? And we'll cover that in the next video. When did it start and how long is it running? You can look at site recovery jobs as well. You can set up alerts and events for your backups so that if in fact a backup does fail, especially on a production level machine, you can actually set up a backup alert for that, and you can configure the notifications accordingly. Now, of course, I don't have any. You can do the same thing for site recovery as well. We can also look up at backup reports. Backup policies, of course, are going to be very, very key for defining how often backups should occur, how long the backup should be retained, things of that nature. And then we can look at the specific backup protected items, the virtual machines, the backup agents, and the backup servers. The backup servers, remember, are the ones that you're more than likely going to deploy on-prem. Replicated items are for Azure Site Recovery. We'll cover that in the future video. And then we can look at the site recovery infrastructure, backup infrastructure, recovery plans, which is how often a replication is going to occur, things of that nature. When should a failover happen in disaster recovery? Once again, we'll cover that in a future video. Now, you might be asking yourself, Brian, this is great, but what actually makes this hybrid capable? So when you actually go and configure a VM here for backup, and I'll do it right now just so that you can see what happens. I'm going to go ahead and click OK, and I'm going to select that particular VM. I'm going to click OK again and specify Enable Backup. Now what is happening here is that a agent is automatically being installed, an agent / extension. The two terms are synonymous. Extension is being installed on the particular VM. That extension is being installed with the necessary configuration and access keys to be able to talk with the Azure Backup Service and to be able to put data in the recovery vault that we created. And that's how the VMs would work inside of Azure. Now, for a VM to work on-prem, what I can do is specify that I'm going to use on-prem VMs, and I'm going to do, let's just say it's a VMware virtual machine. I click Prepare Infrastructure, and what this does is that it allows me to download the Azure Backup Server so that I can actually leverage that for VMware virtual machines. Now, that's for VMware. If I specify Hyper-V as my virtual machine, which is Microsoft technology, then what happens is I still get the Azure Backup Server, but I can also automatically download the backup extension as well. But you can see I can also do files and folders. Files and folders will in fact download the agent for Windows Server or Windows Client, or you can specify, look, I'm already using the latest recovery services agent, so that it can give you the actual vault credentials, because it is a two-part configuration. And I have actually created a video blog post that actually walks you through doing the on-prem deployment, the installing of the agent, the setting up of the recovery services vault with the necessary credentials, and I'll include that as an additional link for you to take a look at. It's something that I've published publicly for you to be able to use. But this is another way for you to be able to do backups, and we'll talk about specific backup types in the next video. If I were to specify one of these others, there would be potentially additional things. So with Microsoft SharePoint, for example, it's going to use the Azure Backup Server as well with vault credentials for that backup server. Now, obviously, if you already have a backup server deployed inside of your data center, then you probably don't need to do anything. But what you would need to do is specify for your new VMs on-prem to be able to talk to that backup server and therefore configure the necessary backups. Then the backup server will actually talk with your recovery services vault to actually push all of those backups. Now, there's something else that I want to talk about here with as far as the way that this works, and it does confuse customers when they first deploy Azure Backup. In the old days, whenever you did something with backup software, you always made sure to schedule those backups to run at, say, 2, 3, 4 a.m. when it was going to have the least impact on your production environment, because backups were so performance intensive on the servers being backed up at the time. With Azure Backup, that is not the case. We've actually offloaded a lot of the processing to the Azure Backup service rather than to the VM. So what this means, though, is two things. One, the backup itself is not very performance intensive. Matter of fact, you can actually have your production environments being backed up in the middle of the day while they're running at peak performance, and Azure Backup will not affect those performance in any significant way. And I've had plenty of customers who have done this successfully with very mission-critical applications, including e-commerce type applications. This also, though, means that the backups are going to run considerably longer than what you're used to. Because they were so performance intensive, they could, of course, be done within 2, and therefore be done in time for peak load to hit them, say, at 8 a.m. in the morning. With the Azure Backup Service, because a lot of the processing now is on the backup service in the cloud rather than on the VMs, the VM is only responding to requests to push data from that backup service. Therefore, a standard backup could take 5 hours, 6 hours, 8 hours, and I've absolutely seen that. I've never seen anything really take much more than that though, but you will see your backups take considerably longer, but you can be assured that the backup is still going to perform successfully and it is not going to affect the performance or functionality of the VMs that are being backed up at the time. Now, of course, you can limit that even further by saying, hey, I only want to do file and folder backups and only do backups of very, very specific things within the VMs, because you can spin up a new VM based on an image faster than it would take for you to spin up a blank one and do a recovery, for example. So that is something to keep in mind. That is how the hybrid capability comes into play. With the combination of the extension and the backup server, the processes being much more innocuous and not performance intensive on the VMs, the Azure Backup Service is a fantastic way for customers to get started in Azure without necessarily having to move their VMs. Matter of fact, my recommendation for customers, if they're just stepping foot into the cloud, they've never really touched the cloud, focus on all of the items that we're going to be talking about here in this series of videos, because it's an excellent way for them to offload some of their operational management, some of the automation, make it part of the cloud, and therefore give back time to their IT management people to be able to work on other new projects. So that is all that there is with respect to Azure Backup. Let's go back over to the deck and we'll talk about what's coming next.